The NHS under pressure. The number of patients on most hospital wards in England has been at levels deemed unsafe this winter. Figures from NHS trusts show that 9 out of 10 hospitals were close to being full, with discharging elderly patients proving to be a major issue. Also on the programme this lunchtime, Trump versus the courts. The legal battles continue over the president's attempts to reinstate the travel ban on 7 mainly Muslim countries. A teenager pleads guilty to killing an American tourist and injuring 5 others in a random attack in London last summer. 3 months after the demolition of the jungle, a special report from Calais, where hundreds of migrants are still trying to get to the UK. Alistair Cook resigns as England Test captain after a record 59 matches in charge. And another royal milestone. The Queen becomes the first British monarch to celebrate 65 years on the throne.
Here in the south, a serious case review into the killing of this 6-year-old girl finds her death couldn't have easily been prevented, and calls for more help for mental health patients like Taryn, who get into trouble with the law.
Good afternoon and welcome to the BBC News at 1. The number of patients on hospital wards has been deemed at levels to be unsafe in 9 out of 10 NHS trusts in England this winter. That's according to the BBC's analysis of NHS figures. The pressure on beds has meant many patients have been at a higher risk of infection and delays in getting treated. Up-to-date figures aren't available for the rest of the UK. NHS England says the main problem is finding alternative care for patients who were medically well but frail. Our correspondent John Maguire has been to a hospital in Somerset to see just how much pressure the NHS is under.
Ask staff here how the winter is going and they use words such as busy, challenging, demanding. Dr. John Tipping shows me how they track exactly what's happening here in the emergency department.
It allows us to see what the pressures are in the system, so it allows us to see how many patients we've had in the last hour.
They deal with everything from aches and breaks to problems breathing, a particular issue for the elderly in winter.
Comparing this January to 4 years ago, we're up 10% on attendances, which doesn't sound huge, but actually we're up 20% on ambulance arrivals and 28% on the number of patients that we've actually had to admit, which gives you an indication that although the numbers aren't massively increased over that time, the complexity and illness level in these patients is definitely rising.
Demand is increasing, so how should we pay for it? A BBC poll found that 51% are against the idea of charging for some services that are currently free, but 37% do support extra charges. 50% wouldn't want income tax to rise because of the NHS, but 40% would back an increase, something, perhaps unsurprisingly, more popular with older people.
You'll never be able to put enough money in, but hopefully you can at least keep catching up. So no, if more money was made available to the NHS, I certainly wouldn't object.
Not an expert on politics, but I would think the fairest way would be to put it on taxes. Those who earn more pay more on a scale. I would think that would be the fairest way.
To live within its means, the NHS has to develop new ways of working. Here in Yeovil, they're pioneering the Frail Older Persons Assessment Service. Staff call it a one-stop shop, an MOT for the body, if you like.
So they're seen by the nurses, a consultant, a junior doctor, a pharmacist, an occupational therapist, and if they need to see a nurse specialist, diabetes, respiratory, we will call them into the unit, so they're seen in one place.
And this team of doctors and nurses, although based in the hospital, goes out into the community, dealing with some of the most vulnerable. Called the Symphony Project, it's another new way of helping patients.
I mean, patients don't want to be in hospital. They want to be looked after within their own homes where that's possible. So we're trying to make the interventions before crisis point is reached so that we can bring all the services together so that we can manage people in their homes more effectively.
The NHS remains cherished, revered and highly valued, but the challenge is to determine at what cost. John Maguire, BBC News, Yeovil.
Meanwhile, the government has announced plans to step up efforts to recover money from so-called health tourists, overseas patients who use the NHS in England. From April, there will be a legal duty on hospitals to ask visitors to pay for non-urgent care up front if they don't qualify for free treatment. With me now is our health editor, Hugh Pym. So-called health tourism, how much does it actually cost the NHS?
Well, Sophie, it's a very complicated situation. First, to be clear, that charging refers to non-urgent care, not emergencies. Wherever you come from in the world, if you get involved in a trauma situation, you're taken in an ambulance to A&E, you will not be charged. Then you've got two groups of people. You've got people from outside Europe who are not eligible for care and ought to be charged. Then people from inside the European Economic Area, as it's known, who will have the EHIC card, who will come and show it. Then it's up to the British government to go back to their governments to claim the money. So let's look at the figures that we have. It's estimated each year about £2 billion of healthcare is provided to overseas visitors, but that includes emergencies that they may have encountered. Of that, and what is recoverable? Well, the government has a target for next year of £500 million to be recovered in England from people who need to be charged. But the National Audit Office regulator, in a report at the end of last year, found that based on what was happening at the moment, there was a shortfall of £150 million impending. And what the government are trying to do is tighten up, get hospitals to charge up front. They'll have a legal duty from April, though the critics are saying, well, actually, this is quite small beer and hospitals can do this anyway.
And all this week across BBC News, we're looking at the state, the health of the NHS. You'd say a fairly sick patient at the moment. Is there a cure?
Well, a lot of people are saying it's money. The UK spends less as a share of its national income on health than France, Germany, the USA. It just needs more money from somewhere. So the question is, where? Well, does it come from taxation? A BBC poll of 1,000 adults done by Ipsos Mori found that 40% of those who responded said they would be prepared to pay more income tax. They were also asked, would you be prepared to pay for some services? 37% said they would. So there are some very big questions around this over the next few years. But it's also about prevention, about making sure people are looked after nearer to home in their community or not getting sick in the first place. And that, I think, is the really big challenge.
Hugh Pym, thank you. The number of mental health patients dying unexpectedly has risen by almost 50% in 3 years. That's according to new figures obtained by the BBC's Panorama programme. The findings are based on data from more than half of England's mental health trusts. Our health correspondent Sophie Hutchinson reports.
In November, Sheila Preston's son Leo died following a suspected accidental overdose. This was her first visit to his flat 4 days later.
This is Leo. This is Leo here. He was probably 12 years old there, and I was proud of him. And he should still be here in this flat today. I wanted to save him.
Leo had schizophrenia. Sheila believes he wasn't getting the help he needed. The trust that treated him says it is improving its services. His is what's known as an unexpected death. They include death from suicide, neglect and misadventure. New figures obtained by the BBC's Panorama programme suggest there's been an almost 50% rise in unexpected deaths over 3 years. The results are based on data from more than half of England's mental health trusts.
Well, SANE is alarmed and shocked by this rise in the death of people with mental illness. And we're particularly concerned because these are the most vulnerable people that we have entrusted into the care of mental health services, and they are so often being failed, both them and their families.
The rise in unexpected deaths coincides with a drop in income for mental health trusts, according to exclusive new figures from the think tank The Health Foundation.
Over the last 4 years, the amount that we spend on healthcare in England has increased by about £8 billion. But mental health trusts have received none of that increase. In fact, when you allow for inflation, their funding has actually fallen by £150 million.
The government says it's improving mental health, investing an extra £1.4 billion by 2020. It insists overall spending, which is not just for mental health trusts, has risen, and that rises in unexpected deaths are due to better reporting. And NHS England also rejects the figures and says suicide in particular is reducing for mental health patients. Sophie Hutchinson, BBC News.
And there's more on that story on tonight's Panorama on BBC One at 8:30. And you can see more on the BBC's NHS Health Check on our website. That's at bbc.co.uk/health. In the battle of Trump versus the courts are winning so far, and the president's doing nothing to hide his frustration. He's stepped up his attacks on the judge who's set aside his travel ban on 7 predominantly Muslim nations. The Justice Department has until this evening to submit its challenge to the decision. Our correspondent Daniel Bircher reports.
What so proudly we hailed.
America brought together by sport and patriotism. The Super Bowl watched by well over 100 million people on television. But outside the stadium, the country's divisions and tensions were all too apparent. More protests against President Trump, and in particular his travel restrictions. Un-American, say his opponents, and unconstitutional. Elsewhere, his supporters made their voices heard. They believe it is the Constitution that gives the president the authority to order these restrictions. Donald Trump was at his Florida retreat to watch the Super Bowl, and despite the legal challenges of the past few days, he defended his order as being effective.
I think it was very smooth. He had 109 people out of hundreds of thousands of travelers, and all we did was vet those people very, very carefully.
It's more than a week since he signed his executive order. The administration argues the president can decide who can enter or stay in the US. But last Friday, a federal court overturned the ban after it was challenged by 2 states. The following day, the president made his first attempt to get the ban restored, arguing his presidential authority was being undermined. Yesterday, that appeal was rejected. Now both sides have until later today to file full submissions. Until the case is decided, the restrictions, which include a travel ban on 7 predominantly Muslim nations, is on hold. But on Twitter, Donald Trump has continued his onslaught against the judge, or so-called judge as the president characterised him, who suspended his ban. Just cannot believe a judge would put our country in such peril, he wrote. If something happens, blame him and court system. People pouring in, bad. Minnesota and Washington State, which are challenging the ban, say there'll be chaos if it's restored. That will be part of their submission for the latest stage of the legal process. Daniel Bircher, BBC News.
Our correspondent Kim Hattas is in Washington. So the president is clearly getting increasingly frustrated about this. But how long could these legal battles go on?
It could take quite a while, and it could go all the way to the Supreme Court. And Donald Trump, the president himself, is certainly not letting go, tweeting again this morning about how these orders that he has put out, this executive order, is the right thing to do, dismissing any criticism as fake news, which is his favorite way to dismiss any challenges to his actions. All weekend, as we saw there in 9 tweets, he raged against the overturning of his ban, against the judge, or the so-called judge, as he called him, even preemptively blaming him, the judge in Washington State, for any potential terrorist attack that could happen in the United States in the future. But this attack against the judiciary has unsettled a lot of people, and he has been chided, Donald Trump has been chided by members of his own party who, of course, want to uphold the separation of powers in their own country. Now, as we saw in this report later today, the Justice Department will present its argument, saying that it's up to the president only to decide who can come into the country, that this is a matter of national security. But until that ban is restored, we have seen many joyful reunions in airports around the country as people with valid visa and even refugees have made their way into the US.
Kim, thank you. A teenager has pleaded guilty to killing an American tourist and injuring 5 other people during a random knife attack in London last summer. 19-year-old Zachariah Bullen denied murder but admitted manslaughter by diminished responsibility. Katrina Renton is at the Old Bailey for us now. Katrina.
Sophie, Zakaria Bulin had been charged with the murder of 64-year-old Darlene Horton and the attempted murder of 5 others. Now, this morning here in Court 8 at the Old Bailey, he said he was not guilty of murder, but was guilty of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. And he admitted wounding 5 others with intent. Now, the Crown explained they were accepting the lesser charges as expert medical evidence showed Bulin had been suffering an acute episode of mental illness, paranoid schizophrenia, at the time, and had been psychotic and appeared to be hallucinating. Now, the court has been hearing more detail about what happened that night. It was around 10:30 on the evening of the 3rd of August. Russell Square was busy with people who had been spending the night out in central London. A man with a large kitchen knife was seen veering across the square, and without any warning or provocation, he stabbed 6 people in relatively quick succession. He said nothing. He tried to run away before police brought him down with a taser stun gun. Now, while on the ground, a police officer claims to have heard him mutter Allah. Now, we've heard a statement read in court today by Darlene Horton's husband. He described her death as an unspeakable tragedy. She'd been visiting London with him and they'd been due to return the next day. Now, at the time, the motive was unclear. It wasn't clear whether it was a terror threat or indeed a random attack, as it turned out to be. Now, a 2-day hearing is taking place here at the Old Bailey, at the end of which Zakaria Bulin will be sentenced. Sophie.
Thank you. The England cricket captain Alistair Cook has announced he's stepping down after 59 tests in charge. That's more than any other England captain. He won the Ashes twice at home in 2013 and 2015, but didn't fare so well last year. Cook said playing for England had been a real privilege. There is some flash photography in Joe Wilson's report.
2012, England's new cricket captain Alistair Cook posed for the cameras like a visit to the dentist. He'd rather not, but knew he had to, so smile. Cook captained his way, this way, old-fashioned, reasonable, and yes, even inspirational. On foreign soil or home, he withstood more test matches than any other England captain. But it takes its toll. The demands get to every skipper eventually. And having lost the recent test series in India emphatically 4-0, Cook decided he'd had enough, explaining in a statement today, stepping down has been an incredibly hard decision, but I know this is the correct decision for me at the right time for the team. Alistair Cook's record makes him one of Britain's outstanding sportsmen in an era when live cricket was only available on pay TV in the UK. England won just over 40% of the test matches Cook captained. Not the best record, but better than most of his predecessors. As a batsman, no Englishman has played more test matches nor made as many runs. Cook recently overtook his mentor, Graham Gooch.
He's worked feverishly hard on his technique throughout the years to improve that technique, and we see, a fantastic test cricketer, the rock of the England batting for the last decade.
Cook is only 32 and wants to carry on as a batsman, but who replaces him as captain? No decision officially yet, but the heir apparent has always been Joe Root. Highly talented batsman, but an unknown as a captain, as he recently reflected in a BBC interview.
It's one of those things that you sort of have to learn on the job. The timing this is quite relevant, but being a dad, you don't really know what to do until you sort of just have to go with it and see how it goes. So I imagine that would be very similar.
Cook once told me he felt his England era had been tarnished by claims made by Kevin Peterson in his book, and that tension took up so much attention. Peterson suggested today on Twitter he's now ready for an England comeback. Far more likely, England will still look to Cook, freed from the responsibility of captaincy, to make more centuries. Joe Wilson, BBC News.
The time is coming up to 1:20 our top story this lunchtime. The NHS under pressure. The number of patients on most hospital wards in England has been at levels deemed unsafe this winter. And still to come, from student artist to one of the country's greatest, we're at a new exhibition tracing the life and works of David Hockney.
And coming up in South today, calls for more help for mental health patients like Taryn who get into trouble with the law. And ready to launch how this experiment made by 3 students from Berkshire could blast off into space. Join us here just before 1:30.
3 months after the Calais migrant camp known as the Jungle was demolished, the BBC has learned that hundreds of migrants are still trying to reach the UK through the Channel port. Despite a police crackdown, scores of migrants are still trying to hide on lorries and enter Britain through Kent, as our correspondent Peter Whittlesey now reports.
It's the last bus to Calais from a small fishing village near Dunkirk. There are dozens of migrants waiting to get on, and others have just returned from Calais. What do you do in Calais?
Going to London.
You try to get to London?
Yeah.
And you then get on this bus, yeah?
Yeah, I come to this bus. I'm going to Dunkirk.
So you come back from Calais?
Yeah.
What have you been doing in Calais? Trying to get on lorries?
Yeah. And the lorry try UK.
Yeah.
Il y a une navette 60. Ouais, on peut pas, c'est pas possible. Maxi 30 personnes.
I asked the bus driver as I got on if this was normal. She said, yeah, every night migrants try and catch the bus, but they have a maximum limit of 30 migrants allowed on the bus. And she's told me last night 60 people tried to get on the bus.
So why are they making the journey? Since the Calais jungle burnt down and was cleared, this camp at Grand Centre became the only official place to stay. But those living here are still determined to get to Britain.
We have 300 shelters here, 300 shelters. Every shelter has like 5 persons inside or 4, and it must be like 1,500 persons.
And how many
include
of those?
Women and children, everything.
And how many of those 1,500 people here are trying to get to Britain?
Everyone in illegal way.
Everyone illegally?
Everyone illegally.
The final stage of their journey is by foot. The destination lorry parks on the outskirts of Calais, where they attempt to break in and stow away on trucks. When Jard barks, that means he can smell something. So they think that probably people are hiding in the field, the other side of the fence. There are now calls in Britain for the French authorities to do more.
It's really important that these buses are stopped so that people can't just go to Calais, try their luck, and then go back home in the evening to the camp in Dunkirk.
Charities claim the camp near Dunkirk has nearly doubled in recent months, meaning more and more migrants are living a commutable distance from Calais. Peter Whittlesey, BBC News.
And viewers in the southeast of England can see that report in full on BBC One at 6:30 tonight. MPs will have the chance to amend the government's legislation on Brexit when it returns to the Commons for 3 more days of debate later this afternoon. A number of pro-Remain Conservative MPs are understood to be considering voting with Labour and the SNP in favour of certain changes, although Downing Street's understood to be confident the bill will be approved. Our political correspondent Tom Bateman is at Westminster. And what kind of changes will they be seeking?
Well, Sophie, you might remember when this bill first went before Parliament, we were talking about the fact that it fitted on a single sheet of paper. Well, now MPs have had the chance to propose a number of amendments, the changes they would like to the legislation. And take a look at this. Well, this is the document that contains many of them. It stretches to 142 pages. So that really tells you something about the appetite among MPs, particularly on the opposition benches, to change, to amend this legislation. Now, it will be up to the parliamentary authorities and the progress of the debate to decide which of those amendments is selected and then voted upon. But we do know that this afternoon an amendment by the Labour MP Harriet Harman will be discussed, and that will call for Theresa May to guarantee the rights of EU citizens who are living in Britain. And then we will have the whole issue about whether Parliament should have what they call a meaningful vote on any Brexit decision before the end of the process. And certainly there are Conservative MPs sympathetic to that. Downing Street said this morning it won't accept any attempt to rejoin the EU by the back door.
Tom, thank you. Badminton and wheelchair rugby are among 5 sports challenging the decision to cut their funding for the Tokyo 2020 Olympic and Paralympic Games. But the funding body says it must prioritise sports with the strongest medal potential. David Ornstein reports.
These sports facing perhaps their biggest battle. Representatives from each will begin meeting UK sport today. The outcome could make or break their hopes for the Tokyo Olympics. Badminton has been hit the hardest by the cuts. £5.7 million to prepare for the last games, nothing for the next. This despite exceeding UK sports target of a quarter-final place in Rio. That was secured by Rajiv Usef before Marcus Ellis and Chris Langridge won an unexpected bronze.
We both want to be, world number one, and we want to show kind of everyone what we can do. And we think at Olympics, we did that, and we want to go one better. But without any funding, it really is so difficult.
We did exceed our target. We have a fantastic programme in place to secure not just one, but even who knows how many medals.
Here at the National Badminton Centre, you don't have to look far for signs of success. But none of that would have been possible without UK sport funding. And the fear is that if this appeal is rejected, that success on the court will not be repeated. Of the other sports to lose their entire funding, fencing had £4.2 million for Rio, wheelchair rugby £3 million, archery £2.9 million, and weightlifting £1.7 million, all cut. Wheelchair rugby is one of the most popular Paralympic sports, and Britain had high expectations for 2020. But not in the eyes of UK sport, who distribute a pot of £345 million to 32 Olympic and Paralympic associations.
I just feel there's something ugly about the decision. We've seen some sports that have got massive increases, and we as the only disability sport effectively have lost all of our funding with massive implications.
The sports appealing believe money should be reallocated more fairly. They'll learn their fate by the end of February. David Ornstein, BBC News in Milton Keynes.
The Queen has become the first British monarch to reign for 65 years. The Prime Minister paid tribute to her, saying she was truly an inspiration to all of us. Nicholas Witchell reports.
In Green Park by Buckingham Palace, a 41-gun salute fired by the King's Troop Royal Horse Artillery to mark Accession Day, the day the Queen came to the throne. It's now 65 years since that moment, so to mark this sapphire jubilee, Buckingham Palace has reissued this photograph of the Queen wearing a sapphire necklace and earrings given to her by her father in 1947. For the Queen herself, though she's been seen several times in public since that heavy cold kept her out of sight over Christmas, today is always a day for quiet contemplation, remembering her father. She's at her Sandringham estate in Norfolk. It was here that George VI died quietly in his sleep on the 6th of February 1952. News of his death was given to a stunned nation by the BBC.
This is London.
The Queen was in Kenya at the time. She returned immediately to London to begin a reign which is now the longest in British history. It's a role to which she remains fully committed.
The Queen will be back here at Buckingham Palace within a matter of days for another year which, despite the fact that she will be 91 in a little more than 2 months' time, shows very little evidence of any significant slowing down.
The younger members of the family, principally Kate, William and Harry, are now deploying their energies very much more fully in support of the Queen. But Britain's head of state still has a busy programme of her own. Among the many engagements in prospect for her this year, there's one significant and very personal anniversary to look forward to. In November, she and the Duke of Edinburgh will reach the 70th anniversary of their wedding in 1947. And something else to anticipate, the prospect of that state visit by President Donald J. Trump. How will the Queen handle that? Well, just like the other 109 state visits she's hosted during a record-breaking reign which began 65 years ago today. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News.
And finally, the works of David Hockney, one of the most influential British artists of the 20th century, are returning to Tate Britain for an exhibition covering 6 decades of his life, as David Sillito reports.
It's a vibrant world of colour. Sun-soaked Californian pools through to grey Yorkshire skies. Those glasses, the mop of blonde hair. David Hockney is instantly recognisable, a brightly coloured star of British art for more than 50 years. And this is his life in paint.
It's certainly comprehensive. In fact, one of the first things that strikes you is just how big this exhibition is.
The exhibition goes right back to 1960.
That's the famous splash painting over there.
There's pop art.
Mr. and Mrs. Clark and Percy.
A room of drawings and then more paintings. And another. And another.
The East Yorkshire landscapes. This is the video art of East Yorkshire. There it is. 13 rooms, 200 works of art. 57 years.
It's a life spent looking, thinking, puzzling about that most basic artistic problem: how to capture what we see.
It seems strange in an era of, well, conceptual art that the one artist everyone knows, he's a proper painter, he's a draftsman, he's everything you'd think of as an artist. Is he a bit old-fashioned?
I think, in a way, he's always been a bit old-fashioned, and that was always his radicalism. And you sort of, you know, he's made, in recent years, landscapes, nothing more traditional than landscapes, but you see him doing it with an iPad or with, you know, massive video installations with the same creativity and imagination that he puts into his painting. So he's deliberately old-fashioned, and that is why he's so different.
From Yorkshire to California, from pop art to landscape, a 57-year journey of thinking about what we're seeing. David Sillito, BBC News.
Time now for a look at the weather with Stav. Hello.
Hi there, thanks Sophie. Hello to you at home. Real blast of winter expected later on in this week. Before we reach that point though, wet and windy spell moving in off the Atlantic. It's been a cold, frosty start. Eastern areas will hold on to that drier, brighter weather for most of the day before the wet and windy weather moves in through the course of the afternoon. There'll be a little bit of winteriness as well over any high ground because the air is really cold, as you can imagine, after this morning's frost. So wet and windy for the southwest of England in towards Wales as the afternoon wears on, whereas further east, the southeast, eastern England, the brightness fading, the clouds thickening, but it's at least staying dry. A little bit of stubborn mist and fog from this morning as well, lingering across some eastern areas. For Northern Ireland, turning wet and windy as that weather front moves in, and that rain just getting in towards western Scotland. You notice a little bit of white there, so turning wintry over the higher ground. Eastern Scotland, though, apart from a few showers, staying dry until after dark. Now, atrocious evening commute across much of the north and the west of the UK, certainly for Northern Ireland, much of Scotland and Northern England. Heavy rain, driving rain, standing water on the road, and gusts of 50 to 60 miles an hour. And that rain will be turning readily to snow over the higher ground of Scotland and also Pennine routes down towards the Peak District. So watch out for that, certainly, if you're driving over the higher ground. The rain eventually reaches eastern side of England as well. It will be mainly of rain here, with the winteriness further north over the higher ground. A bit of a clearance coming in further west with a few showers, but we'll start seeing ice risk for Northern Ireland, Scotland, as those temperatures really fall away. These are the towns and city temperatures, lower than that in rural places. Now, I'm showing you the pressure chart through Tuesday because that weather front will be very slow to clear the east, and eventually it will grind to a halt and work its way westwards for Wednesday onwards. This weather front across the southwest will bring a cluster of showers through the course of Tuesday afternoon. So we start off with that ice risk across the northern half of the UK. Be careful of that. Eastern areas holding on to the cloud, that weather front slow to clear with outbreaks of rain, still quite windy and cold there. Further southwest, a cluster of heavy showers for Wales and the southwest with some hail, maybe some thunder mixed in too. And then on Wednesday, that weather front, a weakening feature, works its way back westward, so a cloudy day for most. Easterly winds begin to dig in, so it's going to start to feel colder, the best of any brightness across the far west. So for the rest of the week then, it's turning much colder, turning really wintry, bitterly cold easterly winds digging in across much of the UK. You really will notice that. And we're likely to see some snow showers feeding in from the east and mainly affecting eastern parts of the UK.
Staff, thank you. And that is all from the BBC News at 1. It's goodbye from me. On BBC One, we join the BBC's news teams where you are. Bye-bye.